In 1989, the 16-bit console war was starting to heat up. Nintendo's NES was still dominating the market, Sega had the Genesis, and NEC arrived with a machine carrying a name that suggested it was every bit as powerful as its competition, the TurboGrafx 16. But there was something rather unusual hiding inside that black casting. The TurboGrafx 16 wasn't actually powered by a 16-bit CPU. Its main processor was an 8-bit HuC6280 running at 7.16 MHz. The graphics were handled by two dedicated chips, the 6270 video display controller and the 6260 video colour encoder. The system could draw from a palette of 512 colours with up to 482 colours on screen at once, and it could handle 64 sprites with a maximum of 16 sprites on a single scan line. So while the name might have suggested a 16-bit machine, the hardware underneath was doing things rather differently, and that's what makes what developers achieved with it even more interesting, because once they got to grips with the hardware, they produced games that could look remarkably colourful, detailed and fast. Just to be clear, this video is focusing exclusively on the base TurboGrafx 16 hardware. There are no TurboGrafx CD games, no Super Graphics games, and no additional hardware being used. We're looking at what developers managed to achieve on the original machine. Welcome back to Popcorn Respawn, I'm Ashton, and today we're counting down 15 TurboGrafx games that pushed the machine to its absolute limits. Before the TurboGrafx 16 had even established itself in North America, the legendary Axe was already showing what the hardware could produce. Developed by Victor Musical Industries, the game was released in Japan in 1988 as Makio Densetsu, before arriving in North America as a TurboGrafx launch title in 1989, and visually it made a very strong first impression. The environments are packed with colour and detail, from dense forests to underground areas, while the character animation gives the combat a much smoother feel than many early 8-bit action games. The enemies are also nicely varied, with some considerably larger than the hero and plenty of animation during combat. It wasn't just the players who noticed either. The game picked up major awards including Video Game of the Year from Video Games and Computer Entertainment and Best TurboGrafx Game from Electronic Gaming Monthly. Not bad for one of the first games available for the system. Veigues' Tactical Gladiator is an interesting example of developers getting to grips with the TurboGrafx relatively early in its life. Originally developed by Game Arts, with Bits Laboratory handling the TurboGrafx version, this side-scrolling shooter puts you behind the controls of the Veigues combat machine. The game has some nicely detailed sprites, particularly the main mech and some of the larger enemies. There's also plenty of activity during the action, with enemy fire, weapons and explosions all competing for your attention. The backgrounds aren't doing anything particularly extravagant, but they don't really need to. The focus is on the machines themselves, and there's some good animation in the way Veigues moves and attacks. The controls can take a little getting used to, but graphically it's a nice early example of what developers were beginning to achieve with the hardware. Outrun is one of those games where the arcade original seems almost designed to make home conversions look bad. Sega's famous driving game relied heavily on fast-moving road effects and scaling to create its sense of speed. The TurboGrafx 16 version arrived in 1990 through NEC Avenue, and while it doesn't match the arcade machine, it does manage to bring the basic experience home. You've still got the Ferrari, the branching routes, the palm trees, the coastline and that unmistakable Outrun atmosphere. The road stretches towards the horizon while scenery moves around you, giving the game a convincing sense of forward movement. It's not the most technically impressive version of Outrun you'll ever see, but that's actually part of why it's interesting. The TurboGrafx 16 wasn't trying to reproduce the arcade hardware exactly, it was finding a way to make the game work on completely different hardware, and considering what it had to work with, that's quite an achievement. Cadash is one of those arcade conversions where the TurboGrafx 16 version does something particularly useful. It doesn't simply try to copy the arcade game and hope for the best. Tato's action RPG arrived on the TurboGrafx in 1991 and retained all 4 character classes from the arcade original. That means Fighter, Mage, Priestess and Ninja are all here. The Genesis version, by comparison, only included the Fighter and Mage. The TurboGrafx version also has its own graphical identity with colourful character sprites, detailed environments and plenty of enemies filling the rooms. The arcade game used larger continuous areas, while the TurboGrafx version divides the adventure into rooms and connected areas to suit the hardware. It's a good example of developers adapting an arcade game rather than simply trying to squeeze the original into a console and hoping for the best. Sega's Afterburner 2 was built around arcade hardware designed to create incredibly fast movement and scaling effects, so bringing it to the TurboGrafx 16 was always going to be a challenge. The TurboGrafx version was released in 1990 with NEC Avenue involved in the release and Bits Laboratory handling the programming and graphics work. And while it obviously isn't identical to the huge arcade machine, the conversion does a respectable job of recreating the sensation of flying through the sky at ridiculous speeds. The aircraft banks from side to side, enemy jets appear in the distance and move towards you, and the scenery rushes beneath the cockpit. There's a lot of movement packed into a game running on hardware that wasn't designed with Sega's Superscaler arcade system in mind. It isn't perfect, but as a technical exercise, it's a fascinating example of how far clever programming could take the TurboGrafx. Splatterhouse was never going to win any awards for being cheerful. Namco's arcade horror game arrived on the TurboGrafx in 1990, bringing its distinctive combination of horror, violence and side-scrolling combat to the home. And visually, this is still one of the more distinctive games on the system. The character sprites are large and detailed, the enemies have some wonderfully unpleasant designs, and the environments do a good job of creating that dark, horror atmosphere. The TurboGrafx version isn't a completely untouched arcade conversion though. The North American release was censored with some of the more graphic imagery altered or removed, but even with those changes the game retains the atmosphere that made the arcade original stand out. Getting an arcade driving game onto home hardware is never particularly straightforward. Special Criminal Investigation, the sequel to Chase HQ, arrived on the TurboGrafx in 1991 and brings the same basic idea to the living room. Chase criminals, shoot their cars and try not to turn your police vehicle into scrap metal. The interesting part visually is the sense of movement. The road stretches into the distance while vehicles approach and move around the player, creating the impression of travelling at speed. The game also has a good amount of scenery alongside the road, giving the stages more variety than simply driving along an empty strip of tarmac. It obviously isn't a modern 3D racing game, but that's not really the point. For a machine that wasn't designed around polygonal 3D graphics, getting this sort of perspective-based driving effect running on the hardware was a neat trick. Final Soldier is the third game in Hudson's Star Soldier series and by this point the developers clearly knew exactly what sort of game they wanted to make. Released in 1991 and developed by Now Production, it's another fast vertical shooter, but this time the presentation is a little more polished and colourful. The game throws a steady stream of enemies at you while your ship can collect different weapon upgrades and increase its firepower. The later stages become particularly busy with larger enemies, projectiles and explosions all appearing together, and that's really where Final Soldier earns its place here. It doesn't rely on one huge graphical trick, instead it's the combination of smooth scrolling, colourful sprites, enemy formations and constant action that makes the game look so good. Sometimes the impressive part isn't one particular effect, it's simply how well everything works together. By 1993, Hudson had been making Bomberman games for years, and Bomberman 94 is a pretty good demonstration of just how polished the formula had become. The game is packed with colourful characters, detailed environments and plenty of animation. It also introduced Rui, the creatures that became known as Louis on the Mega Drive version, giving Bomberman a new way to get around the stages. And then there's the multiplayer. The PC Engine version supports up to 5 players in Battle Game. That's 5 players, a load of bombs and presumably at least one friendship that didn't survive the evening. Graphically, the game manages to keep everything clear even when the arena becomes crowded with explosions and moving characters. It may look simple, but getting that much colourful activity onto the screen while keeping the game easy to read is part of what makes Bomberman 94 such a polished looking game. Liquid Kids is a slightly different kind of graphical showcase. Also known as Mizubaku Adventure, this Taito platform game puts you in control of Hippopo, a rather adorable little hippo who attacks enemies using water bombs. And those water bombs are the star of the show. You can throw them, use them to defeat enemies and manipulate the environment as you work your way through the colourful stages. The characters are full of personality, the animation is lively and the bright colours suit the cartoon style presentation perfectly. The TurboGrafx 16 version is actually missing some of the graphical effects found in the arcade game, including parallax scrolling and certain time transition effects, but the core gameplay and visual style remain remarkably intact. So Liquid Kids isn't here because it somehow improves on the arcade hardware. It's here because it demonstrates how well the TurboGrafx 16 could produce a colourful, animation-heavy arcade game using a HuCard. Magical Chase takes the TurboGrafx 16 in a completely different direction. Instead of giant spaceships or heavily armed mechs, you've got Ripple, an apprentice witch flying through a world that looks like someone emptied an entire box of colouring crayons onto the screen. Developed by Quest, Magical Chase is a horizontal scrolling shooter with a wonderful colourful style. The backgrounds are full of bright colours and small details, while Ripple and the enemies have a distinctive cartoon-like appearance. There's also a lot happening around the player, particularly during later sections when enemies and projectiles start filling the screen. What I like most about Magical Chase is how consistent the visual style is. It doesn't need dark metallic environments or giant explosions to look impressive. It simply looks colourful, polished and very different from most of the other shooters on the system. Ninja Spirit arrived on the TurboGrafx 16 in 1990 and visually it doesn't waste much time showing what the hardware can handle. Developed by Irem, this side-scrolling action game takes you through 7 stages as Moonlight sets out to avenge his father's murder. The action can become surprisingly busy with enemies attacking from different directions while weapons and projectiles are flying across the screen. But the real visual treat is Moonlight's shadow technique. the game can create additional versions of the character that mirror his movements, effectively putting several copies of your ninja into the action at once. Add in detailed enemy sprites, weapon animations and atmospheric backgrounds, and Ninja Spirit becomes a very good demonstration of the system's ability to keep the screen active without losing the visual clarity of the action. It may not have reinvented the ninja game, but it certainly knew how to make one look good. If Bond decided he wanted to leave the prehistoric era behind and become a futuristic cyborg, he'd end up with Zonk. Known as PC Denjin in Japan, the 1992 side-scrolling shooter was developed by Red Company and published by Hudson Soft, and subtle isn't really the word I'd use to describe it. The game is packed with bright colours, strange enemies and some wonderfully imaginative bosses. Zonk himself has a huge range of expressions and animations, while the enemies have a suitably ridiculous collection of designs. Then there are the boss battles, which are often where the game really lets its imagination loose. It's colourful, busy and completely committed to its bizarre visual style. Zonk doesn't try to look realistic, thankfully, because I'm not sure a cyborg version of Bonk was ever going to win any prizes for realism. By the time Hudson released Soldier Blade in 1992, they'd become very good at making the TurboGrafx work extremely hard. This is the fourth game in the Star Soldier series and it's built around speed. The game throws enemy formations at you constantly, while large ships, explosions and weapon effects keep the screen busy, and somehow the action remains surprisingly readable. That's probably one of the things I like most about Soldier Blade. It doesn't need a giant character or some complicated graphical effect to impress you. It's the sheer amount of action being handled at once. The 7 stages are packed with enemies and set pieces, and the game keeps moving quickly without turning into an unreadable mess. For a console with an 8-bit CPU, this is one of those games that makes you stop and think, okay, how exactly are they doing this? And finally, we have the game that probably had the biggest "how on earth did they fit this on here" factor of the entire list: Street Fighter 2 Champion Edition. Capcom's legendary arcade fighter arrived on the PC Engine in Japan in 1993, and NEC managed to squeeze it onto a 20 megabit HuCard. Just stop and think about that for a second. This isn't a simplified fighting game made to look a little bit like Street Fighter. It's Street Fighter 2 Champion Edition. You've got the full roster of fighters, their special moves, individual stages and the fast-paced fighting that made the arcade game such a phenomenon. And despite the TurboGrafx 16 8-bit CPU, the game looks remarkably close to what you'd expect from a much more powerful machine. The character sprites are large, colourful and well animated, and the stages retain their individual identities rather than looking like generic backgrounds thrown together at the last minute. The 20 megabit HuCard was a technical achievement in itself, but getting a game like Street Fighter 2 running on the base hardware is what makes this such an appropriate game to finish the countdown, because if someone had told you an 8-bit CPU would be running Street Fighter 2 on a credit card sized cartridge a few years earlier, you probably wouldn't have believed them. Looking back at the TurboGrafx 16, it's easy to focus on the fact that its CPU was only 8-bit. But that doesn't tell the whole story. The combination of the HuC6280 and those dedicated graphics processors gave developers a surprisingly capable machine to work with, and these games show just how differently they could use it. From shooters packed with enemies and explosions to huge arcade conversions and colourful games like Magical Chase and Liquid Kids, there's a lot more variety here than the TurboGrafx 16 sometimes gets credit for. And we haven't even touched the TurboGrafx CD or Super Graphics. Those are for another video. So, which game did you think pushed the TurboGrafx the furthest? Did I miss any of your favourites off the list? As always, let me know in the comments below. I always love reading what you have to say. If you enjoyed this video, head over and check out some of the other videos in the series. Please hit the like button and subscribe to Popcorn Respawn if you haven't already. And if you ever fancy throwing a cup of tea's worth of support toward the channel, you can now hit the join button. Completely optional, of course. Honestly, just watching, commenting and subscribing is huge, so thank you all so much for all your support in getting the channel to where we are today. Thanks for watching, and until the next time, see ya!
Videos and I am